So today we are going to talk about libertarianism, what everyone needs to know. I'd like to just preface this by saying I was pretty impressed with this book despite the low rating. I'm generally impressed by the What Everyone Needs to Know series. This is the second one I've read. It's put out by Oxford University Press. What the general format is that they take commonly asked questions and then they answer them in very basic, straightforward ways that are accessible to everyone, and you don't need a background in this sort of thing in order to know it. So, for example, libertarianism, a background in philosophy or political science would help for understanding it, but you don't need it in order to read this book. So, broad strokes, there are three branches of libertarianism. The one that's kind of commonly known in the media, or what people think of when they think of libertarianism, is actually not the most common, but it is known as hard libertarianism. So, this sort of libertarianism, like other forms of libertarianism, is pretty aggressively free market, but the distinction is that they are, first, a lot of them valorize selfishness. So perhaps the best example of a hard libertarian, or the most commonly known one, would be Ayn Rand, who I believe wrote an essay called The Virtue of Selfishness. Another thing is a lot of hard libertarians are just no government intervention ever for the sake of anything. So a lot, or not a lot of them, but some of them are anarchists. And so they just take this very hard line. Whereas the other two branches of libertarianism are, they think that social good is important, but that social good is created through free markets. And they also think that governments in general are inefficient, but sometimes they should do stuff. But what they feel that people aren't aware of how the government just fails and is inept and that sort of thing, rather than just structurally objecting to government intervention at all, which is kind of the line the hard libertarians take. Okay, the other two, we have the classical libertarian, who is kind of invokes a lot of the French philosophers that were early in the Enlightenment. And then there is, I think it's neo-libertarians, who are more concerned with social justice issues than classical libertarians. And the distinction that the book makes is they talk about positive freedoms versus negative freedoms. I think freedoms is the word, not 100% sure. But a positive freedom or a negative freedom is you are free from other people interfering with your life. So, for example, if a state says I have to have a certain religion, that's an impediment on my freedom. If a state has no say in what your religion is, then you have the negative freedom in the sense that the state can't tell you what to do. Positive freedom is your ability to do things. So let's say I'm really poor and I don't have a lot of opportunities. I would be low in positive freedom even if no one's saying that I can't do this and I can't do that. I just would be unable to for my own reasons. Okay? So the classical libertarians basically only focus on negative freedom, and the neo-libertarians focus on positive freedom as well. But broad strokes, they kind of have the same way of thinking, which can be best captured, or all three of them really, by live and let live is probably the easiest way to capture it. It's an oversimplification, but what this shakes out to being is they look socially liberal and fiscally conservative. So let's unpack that a little bit. So for the socially liberal one, I'm just going to give a few examples. First of all, they're against the war on drugs. They believe that it is. So first of all, they don't think that the state should protect people from themselves, and that's what largely telling people they can't do drugs is protecting them from themselves. And then second of all, they think that even if you thought that was a good thing, that it is demonstrably not effective in terms of outcomes, because what it does is when you have a war on drugs, you create a black market and you create a system that operates outside the law and needs to operate outside the law, and you financially pump money into it. So, for example, prohibition created the mob because you needed to operate outside the law in order to enforce things. Like if I am a drug dealer and I have a problem with Bob, the drug dealer down the street, I can't go to the cops, right? If Bob is stepping on my territory. Instead, I have to kneecap Bob, which obviously creates crime and it creates people who are violently operating outside the law. Whereas if I own a Home Depot and Bob owns a Lowe's down the street, if I have a problem with Bob the builder, as it were, then I can just take it up with either law enforcement or the courts. So it creates, it has perverse incentives for creating crime. Is a secondary argument beyond people should just be allowed to do what they want to do. So to that end, they also support gay marriage. If the metric is this freedom impinging on someone else's freedom? And if the answer is no, libertarians are for it. So, for example, they're against censorship. One of the most striking examples, or I thought the most interesting, was just being very pro-immigration. And the argument for this is perhaps twofold. Okay, the first is on the social level, where they argue that freedom of movement is a basic human right. To some extent, where you are born is rather arbitrary, and people should be allowed to pursue whatever sort of dreams they want. They should just have maximal liberty. Preventing someone from crossing a border is an impingement on their liberty. And so what they argue is people should be allowed to go where they want to go and seek what type of work they want to seek. And if you don't think that that should be the case, the burden's on you to tell why you don't think that should be the case. Interesting little distinction here. This is different than just saying citizenship for everyone. So, for example, in the United States, what this might manifest as is work visas for anyone who wants one, provided they don't have a criminal record, so because that would be a reason to exclude someone. And then you just don't necessarily have to grant full citizenship. The second reason is a free market reason. So by and large, they think that if there are two consenting parties to any sort of market exchange, it should be allowed to take place. And what they feel that preventing immigration does is it prevents people from engaging in commerce in this specific case of like labor. So if someone can't come over and engage in labor, that artificially affects the price of labor in an inefficient way. And I forget the philosopher, they invoke, there's one philosopher who uses the Starvin' Marvin example, where if there was someone who was starving and they had money to buy food, and you prevented them from going to the store, everyone kind of agrees this is morally wrong, right? Let's say the store is 2 blocks away and they want to go to the store and you say, nope, you can't go, and they starve to death. Everyone thinks that in some sense you killed this Marvin, okay? Now you could have the same sort of structure where now Marvin is trying to get money to buy food, and 2 blocks away, he wants to walk and have a job. And you say, no, Marvin, you can't do it. So Marvin starves to death. In some sense, you caused the death of Marvin. They feel that the same logic applies to immigration, where if you are preventing someone from crossing a border in order to seek work, you are in effect using violence to prevent them from doing what they want to do. A lot of the way that they characterize whenever the state makes you do something is that the end result is always, like, the end threat is always violence, right? For example, when the state makes me register my car, if I don't register, I will get more notices. If I don't, go with those notices, I will get tickets. If I don't pay my tickets or don't show up for my tickets, I will be arrested. If I try to not be arrested, I will be forcibly and violently arrested. So there's eventually a sort of regress where violence is used to enforce everything. And so the state argues, just generally speaking, libertarians are pretty anti-violence. They think that imperialist foreign policy causes more problems than it helps. And so they're generally very against military intervention in other countries. For example, the analysis of wars in the Middle East is that America stuck their finger in the pie, and that's why we have stuff like 9/11. And some of the analysis goes a little bit like Norway has more freedom than America. Norway didn't get attacked because Norway is not intervening in Middle East affairs. America got attacked because they're intervening. Like the classic, oh, they hate us for our freedom line that I think Bush gave. Libertarians aren't buying that. Okay, back to the immigration. The second thing is that they think that preventing immigration just creates a market failure. You know, there are two parties that are consenting. This is mainly in the case of like thinking of it in terms of labor. Let's say there's someone in the United States who wants to hire someone from Brazil, okay? And they would both consent to this exchange, but the limit on immigration prevents the Brazilian from coming over and working for the American. What they argue is that this creates inefficiency, and that the number they throw out that has been estimated by economists is if you just completely open borders, GDP would double. And they also address some of the concerns, but I cannot reconstruct the arguments here because I don't remember them. But they do address concerns. And so if you're curious about that type of argument, it's in there. Okay, so socially liberal. 3 examples, pro-gay marriage, against the war on drugs, pro-immigration. Second is they are fiscally conservative. So generally speaking, they think that the government is too big and that so in economics, you have something that's called market failures that create inefficiency. So for an example, a market failure, if a country, or if the easiest one maybe to think about is pollution. Let's say a company is polluting a lot. They do not have to, when pollution and smog goes into the air, that incurs a cost on society. But the company that's doing the polluting doesn't have to pay the cost. And so that means that they are getting more money coming in than they ought to because they don't have to pay for the cost. And instead, society has started having to pay for the cost of pollution, not the company doing the polluting. So we have a market failure. What is generally proposed in sort of economics textbooks is that in order to solve this market failure, you have a sort of tax on the company that's polluting that is supposed to be appropriately leveled against the amount of pollution that they're putting out, such that they end up paying for their pollution rather than having society pay for it. The argument that the libertarians make is that a similar type of failure occurs when government intervenes. They argue that since government is so much less efficient than private firms, and also there's corruption in government, that often the government will have its own sort of failures when it tries to intervene. And when the government intervenes and is inefficient, all of society pays for it because they pay in taxes. So the basic argument they make is, look, I appreciate that there are market failures, but there are also government failures, and so we can't go along with everything. This is kind of the basic structure of the argument, but they do argue further that a lot of government sort of intervention that's supposed to help actually hurts and contributes to crony capitalism and prevents small firms from succeeding. So an example, they gave this large corn conglomerate that is subsidized by the government, and they lobby for these subsidies, and that often small businesses cannot lobby for subsidies, for example, and a lot of regulation that gets put in place is disproportionately expensive for small businesses. So what they argue is a lot of the government intervention just ends up propping up these really big companies that shouldn't be propped up or receiving financial aid. One that is particularly problematic in the eyes of the author of the book, who is Jason Brennan, I forgot to mention that, is that the governments basically always bail out financial institutions when they fail. And so what you have is their profits are private, but when they're making money, but when they fail, their losses become public, right? Because if the government bails it out, everyone's taxes goes to bailing it out. And so what libertarians argue for is just very low government intervention and just having free open markets. So they're against like trade tariffs and that sort of thing because they think that they're inefficient. This secondarily, this free market thing becomes a bit of a moral argument because they argue that it is the best way to pull people out of poverty. The example or argument that gets used throughout the book pretty frequently is that it is only in free market societies where people have a lot of liberty and opportunity, and in places where markets aren't free, you just don't see that. So even if there's huge inequality and things aren't maximally free for everyone, it seems to be the case that free market just takes the best crack at it. There's also a type of like argument that libertarians make is something might not always be successful, but it still might be the best option available. So they are socially liberal and fiscally conservative. They are not fans of nanny state or big government intervention, nor of war or government intervention of that kind. So let's get into the ratings a little bit. For utility, I give this a 3. I don't think that this book is necessarily too useful. It can give you arguments if you're a libertarian for why certain views should be the case. Also pretty interesting was most people don't identify as libertarian, but the author cites some studies that what it does is it takes polls of people and shows that they basically have libertarian views rather than conservative or liberal views. And that the true number of libertarians, at least in the United States, is somewhere between 10 and 25%. I don't know, I haven't looked at these studies, but seeing it is a bit interesting because fairly often I hear people say that they're socially liberal and fiscally conservative, and this seems like a good example of that, although I don't think not too many people I know who are fiscally conservative are for ending the drug war and pro-immigration. Okay. So utility, I gave it a 3. It's a little bit useful, but for the most part, not really. Novelty, I give it a 4. I think if you go without reading this book, that's completely fine. I don't think that this book provides a tremendous amount of utility, so it also scores low on novelty. In terms of just refining and knowing like exactly where you are politically, if you think you might be libertarian, this book is interesting and would be like scoring higher on novelty because of that. It's also quite thin. It's a little thin book. It's maybe like 160 reading pages, 175, 180. So in terms of efficiency, this book's like a really easy and quick read. So novelty, I give it a 4. Entertainment, I gave it a 3.5. For the most part, it's not like hyper boring or language that is impossible to read, but for the most part, there's no like entertainment value. It reads a little bit like just slightly like a reference book, in that it has chapters that go over topics, and it's just Q&A throughout the whole thing. Like the sections are human nature and ethics, government and democracy, basics of libertarianism, civil rights, economic freedom, social justice and the poor, which is a bit interesting because one objection to libertarianism in general is that it doesn't help out the poor, and they offer some defense of their positions. Contemporary problems, politics yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So it just like runs through it. There's no narrative sort of structure, so okay. For style, I gave it a 7. It's written in a way that's very easily accessible. It's not like flashy or anything, but I think it's well written on account of it being highly readable, still invoking a lot of like philosophical thinkers or relevant thinkers in the areas. So readability, I also gave it an 8, which is pretty good. For interest, I gave it a 7. I think that maybe this book is more interesting for me. For a while, I've thought that I'm basically libertarian, but then like I just disagree on a few things, and that this book has really clarified that my position is effectively like a libertarian one. I think that liberty, more so than like empathy, really informs a lot of my thinking. Where I diverge with the libertarians is there's like one thing that like I'm really unsure of is they're for making selling your organs legal, and I just think like I don't even disagree with them on a philosophical basis. I disagree with them on an empirical basis, which I think doing that might cause problems in terms of creating perverse incentives. Uh, and this is like a practical objection, not a philosophical objection, because I think people should be allowed to do what they want. And the second point I disagree with them on is I feel that libertarians think, based on my reading of this book, that consensual exchange sort of guarantees fairness, and I don't think it necessarily guarantees fairness, but it's necessary for fairness. And so I'm perhaps more pro-government intervention than the libertarians, but I think that a lot of their objections about government interference are like valid, and so to the extent of uprooting subsidies that are not extremely important, I'm all for that. But positive injections into the economy that are meant to help people, I'm more likely to agree with some of those than libertarians, I think, who just seem categorically kind of opposed. So in that sense, this book was interesting for me. As far as recommendations go, the overall is 5.42, I think. As far as recommendations go, I would recommend this if you identify as, let's say, socially liberal and fiscally conservative. I think this would be an interesting read, just as a general sort of, just like fleshing out your own ideas politically, if politics is of interest to you. I think that there aren't a lot of people who explicitly identify as libertarian, or this is what the book was saying. And I think that it otherwise is perhaps not very important to read because you won't necessarily encounter a lot of libertarians. If you encountered a lot, for example, it might be better to have a more nuanced view, but if you're not, okay. It is quite quick. In general, I would recommend the What You Need to Know series because I've been quite impressed with it in terms of putting out quality information at a really efficient rate in a way that is easy to understand. And I think they do a really good job. As far as discussion goes, are there any libertarians in the House? If you do feel libertarian, but you object to one of the points I put forward, put in the comments why you object. If you like this, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, that whole stuff, and have a good day.